Alrighty, we'll pick it up on session 16 of the first Regathering, Modern Israel. Let me do a little bit of a review. We're nearing the end of the major section 3 of your outline. 1947 will be the end of section 3, and we're rapidly approaching that date. Now, I'm going to take you on a little trip down memory lane for our review. Remember, a number of classes back, we looked at the fact that stockade and watchtower settlements were thrown up in response to the Woodenhead report. Well, as I was rummaging around through the internet looking for appropriate pictures, I happened across this one. A few weeks late, but there it is. There is an example of a stockade and watchtower settlement. Remember, all that stuff was basically prefab, and that plot of ground 24 hours earlier was bare. Then the Zionists would come out, and 24 hours later you'd have a stockade and watchtower settlement. Economic viability wasn't the idea. The idea was getting a footprint on the ground. So when Israel was divided up according to the mandate, the revised mandate, there'd be a Jewish footprint in the Galilee, for example. So there's an example of a stockade and watchtower settlement. Here is a picture of one of the watchtowers going up. Again, you can see that it's on the back of a truck, and it's been prefab, been made somewhere else, and now it's being set up. And by the way, that is a small one. The Zionists did watchtowers sometimes twice that size. But around 1937, just before, well, 1937 was the Arab Revolt, so the early 40s here. Alrighty, we also talked about Captain Wingate years ago. A few sessions ago, where we learned that he was put in charge of the Ghafirs. Remember the night squads that went out and protected the Yishuv from the marauding Arab bands? Well, I found a picture of one of the night squads too. There's a couple. Yeah, there are a couple of trucks backed up together, and that's one of the squads that helped protect the Yishuv. And here is a member of one of the night squads, Moshe Dayan, as a Ghafir. That's young Moshe Dayan in his British Ghafir uniform.
What is it, Ghafir?
That's the night squads, the special units that were put together. And remember, we talked about the Haganah putting together their first an early naval arm and an early air arm. Well, I ran across this picture too. The first flight course of the Haganah, 10 students, 1937. So even just before the beginning of World War II, this was the beginning of the Israeli Air Force of today. This very first flight course, these first 10 students eventually became what we have today as the IAF. So things have changed. Yes, things have changed. We talked about the Holocaust last week, and we saw that the main reason for the Holocaust is a challenge, an attempt to destroy the nation promise or the seed promise of the Abrahamic covenant. If there are no Jewish people alive on planet Earth, there's no Jewish people to call Yeshua back. And so the second coming won't occur, and Satan's career is safe. In addition, if there is no nation, according to the promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that promise can't be fulfilled, and God is shown to be less than God. So that's an attack. The Holocaust is an attack on the seed promise, the nation promise of the Abrahamic covenant. I showed you some pictures out of the Holocaust. Here are these men, women, and children being gunned down near Kiev by the Einsatzgruppen. And the very famous picture of the boy. And yes, indeed, the boy has survived, and you can read about him in the book called The Boy by Dan Porat. If you're interested, it's on Amazon.com. I'm sure it's a fascinating reading, The Boy by Dan Porat. We all looked at this picture of some of the survivors, human skeletons, men very close to death. And this very famous picture, famous because it contains the portrait of Elie Wiesel in his place in the barracks. And of course, Elie Wiesel wrote Night, another worthwhile book to read if you want to study the Holocaust. And it was recommended to me, and Schindler's List is a worthwhile movie seeing, not because it's pleasant, but because it shows you what really went on. And then it was recommended to me to read Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi. So if you're interested in this book, I haven't read it myself, but it comes recommended. Survival in Auschwitz. So there's another book of many, many books you can read on the Holocaust. So right now we are going to take a quick view of the Holocaust. This is just a DVD that touches the tip of the iceberg. It is a very, it's a mild DVD, believe me. It's not, well, some of the people in the morning class felt it was hard to watch, but really it's a mild DVD. And if you haven't seen anything like this, perhaps it is a little bit difficult to watch. But it's program 4, a 30-minute program, 27 minutes, The Miracle of Survival, Hitler and the Holocaust, okay? So we're going to go to there right now, and I'll turn off the technology, and we'll get the lights, and we'll take a look at this video. Those of you that are on YouTube, you'll have to go to somewhere on the internet to find this video, but it is available. Question?
I just had a comment. I can't remember which show I saw it on, but it's just been in the last day or two. There was a man, and I don't remember his name, but he's now 110 years old.
Yes,
He came to help the children get out of, I think it was Poland.
Right, okay, yeah.
And this thing that they had were all of these people that he had helped, of course adults now, he was invited to this gathering, and he didn't know what it was for, and then they said, this is for you.
You saved me.
They all stood up and, oh my
Oh,
goodness.
okay. Was that a video, a DVD, a video, or?
It
was on the TV.
60 minutes.
All right. Well, okay.
And I just thought, when I saw the scripture, I will bless those who bless you.
Yeah. So he was over 100 years old. He was part of the operation that took children,
To an auditorium and all this.
Jewish children out of
Yeah.
Poland.
And then they asked you to stand up.
Yeah.
That's right. No, he was an independent, individual guy
Yeah.
that
Yep.
had.
He's a stockbroker.
Yeah, so
Oh,
what he
he
would do is he could go and basically make arrangements to
Get the kids out, yeah.
Czechoslovakia
Wow.
on trains to get over.
Okay. Well, how can anyone find that? You know what it was called?
It's on 60 Minutes.
It's on 60. It's on 60 Minutes. Okay. Well, you'll have to look for it on 60
The
Minutes.
movie's called Nikki's Family.
Nikki's Family on 60 Minutes. Okay. You guys on YouTube?
$4.99 to rent on Amazon Prime,
Uh,
or it's free on Netflix.
All right. It's on Netflix or Amazon Prime for you guys on YouTube here. Nikki's Family. All right. Let me turn off the technology. All righty. We're underway. And we're going to pick it up on page 130 of your notebook. Now, before we get into the material after World War II, I just want to review the importance of World Wars I and II. First of all, the importance of World War I was brought out in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24:3 and verses 7 and 8. Remember, the disciples asked Yeshua 3 questions. The third question being, what is the sign of the end of the age? And Yeshua answered that by saying, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs. And I pointed out to you that nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom are Jewish figures of speech during the first century for a world war. And the birth pang, the term birth pang, is a biblical figure of speech for the end days. So to summarize it, the answer to the third question, when you see a world war, that is the sign of the end of the age. So World War I marked the beginning of the birth pangs, the beginning of the end of the age. So we've been in the last days, the end of the age, since 1914. And you can get more details on this if you pick up Footsteps of the Messiah by Dr. Fruchtenbaum. More details on that. So, back to the question. What is the importance of World Wars I and II? World War I. First of all, it marked the beginning of the end of the age. But World War I also provided the opportunity for the Jewish national home. The Ottoman Empire was defeated. And so now the door was open to Arab and Jewish nationalism. And the Arab peoples had been promised nations, which the mandatory powers began to work on, and so were the Jewish people. Now, World War II then dramatized the need for the Jewish national home, because even though the mandate for the Middle East given to Britain and France The mandate was to create, was nation building, create nations. The Arabs always opposed the formation of the Jewish national home. And so the events of the Holocaust dramatized very, very clearly that the Jewish people did need a place of refuge, a home. So that's where we pick it up, back on page 130 of your outline.
We don't have those slides, do we, those little...
No, that's did you want them? Okay. What slides did you want specifically, Cindy?
Those, just those last...
The importance of...
World War I and II.
All right.
We're going to have to charge Cindy a little bit.
I think you should go.
All right, we'll give you guys those slides.
It was Mary's idea.
It was Mary's idea. Okay. She's denying it. Oh no, all righty.
Send me the bill.
Send you the bill. Okay. All righty. Bevin's Declaration on Israel, the bottom of page 130. Now, following the end of World War II, Europe was teeming with displaced persons. Now, President Truman paid special attention to the plight of the Jewish refugee. He directed that no Eastern European Jew would be turned away from the refugee camps in Germany. Therefore, the refugee traffic from the east to the German relocation camps gained momentum. By the summer of 1945, nearly 100,000 Jewish displaced persons, DPs, had reached Germany. Many thousands of Jewish families were now in Germany. One such family was the Fruchtenbaum family and their young son, Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum. Dr. Fruchtenbaum would then come to the United States eventually and become a believer, and he became the founder and director of Ariel Ministries. So this is his story. The Displaced Persons Camp is his story. If you go to the Ariel website, this is the home page, go to About, and the menu will come down, and you can see Dr. Fruchtenbaum. You can go to that page, and this is just a little excerpt from that page. Arnold Fruchtenbaum was born in 1943 in Siberia, Russia. After his Jewish father, falsely accused of being a Nazi spy when he fled Poland from Hitler, was released from a communist prison. So just to give you a geographic orientation, this is Russia. Here is the Ural Mountains. This mountain range provides the border between Western Russia and Siberia. So let's take a look. Here's Western Russia and Siberia with the Ural Mountains there in between. The red province is the province in which the town in which Arnold Fruchtenbaum was born is located, and that town is Tobolsk. Tobolsk was the capital of Siberia. It is also known as Tubal in Ezekiel 38:2. So Tobolsk, the capital of Siberia, was where Arnold was born, 1943. With the help of the Israeli underground in 1947, Arnold is about 4 years old now, the Fruchtenbaum family escaped from behind the Iron Curtain to Germany, where they were confined to British displaced persons camps. There, Arnold received Orthodox Jewish training from his father before the family finally immigrated to New York in 1951. So he came to the United States when he was about 7 or 8 years old. So I just point that out because this is a first-person account. The people living in the displaced persons camps are not faceless, nameless relics of history. You know one of these people. You've been taught by one of these people, you know. And Arnold still bears the effects of all that he went through as a young man. All right, let's move on. At the same time, the Labour Party in Britain won a stunning victory, an upset victory. Clement Attlee came to the Prime Ministership. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, you have his picture on page 130. Now, hopes in the Yishuv revived dramatically. The British workers will understand our aims, Ben-Gurion declared exultantly upon hearing the news. Page 131. The community that now demanded recognition was no longer a precarious minority settlement. By 1944, the Jewish population of Palestine had reached 560,000. Its economy had been profoundly stimulated by the war. Almost half of its food needs could now be supplied by its own farms. Industrial production had risen dramatically. Ben-Gurion then led a deputation to London within 109 days of the Labour Party's accession to power. He carried with him a request for the immediate admittance into Palestine of the 100,000 Jewish displaced persons. On August 25, 1945, the Colonial Office replied with an exceedingly generous offer. Takes my breath away how generous they were. An offer of 2,000 immigrant certificates. They happened to be leftovers from the original white paper allotment. And a supplemental monthly quota of 1,400 provided the Arabs agreed. How generous. This response dumbfounded and appalled the Zionist leadership. By then, a guideline for the entire Middle East already had been prepared by the Labor Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. And you have this picture of Ernest Bevin on page 131. This picture makes him look like a very irascible man, and I suspect he was. He was no friend of the Jewish people or of the modern state of Israel. It was accepted as unchallengeable the importance of maintaining the friendship of the Arab world, and one reason was economic. Britain in 1945 was virtually bankrupt. One of Bevin's priority concerns during these grim post-war years was to assure the security of the single most important of Britain's remaining overseas resources, and that was oil, petroleum, the power source of the country's very industrial existence, and a foreign currency earner of near sacred importance. Britain's vast holdings were concentrated in the Middle East, partly in Iran, but largely too in the vast Kirkuk oil field, in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Qatar. The need for oil and pipeline easements was one factor in determining Bevin's Middle Eastern policy. Geopolitical strategy was another. The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was emerging as a potentially far more serious threat to Britain's military and economic dominance of the Middle East. Now, Bevin appreciated with acute urgency that Britain's sphere of influence in the Persian Gulf, with its immense oil reserves, and in the lower Middle East, fronting the warm waters of the Mediterranean, had to be protected at any cost. But he was not unfamiliar with the Palestine question. At the time of the second Labor government under Ramsay MacDonald, when the Zionists were denouncing the Passfield White Paper, representatives of the Histadrut had called on Bevin as a fellow trade unionist for help, and he gave it willingly. His intercession with MacDonald had played a decisive role in safeguarding the Zionist cause. Now, however, we're 15 years later. 15 years later, and Bevin was unwilling as Foreign Secretary to thrust himself into the Palestine question without a detailed additional study. Page 132. Things were not exactly pleasant in the United States either. In the United States, by early 1945, the State Department had moved firmly to a position of anti-Zionism. Our State Department was absolutely opposed to the Jewish national home. Undersecretary Joseph Grew, and here is his photograph. You have that at the top of page 132. U.S. Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew warned the Roosevelt administration that, quote, Zionist activities in this country will remain the gravest threat to friendly relations between the United States and the countries of the Near East, also known as the Arabs, with a solution until a solution to the problem is reached. So American Zionism is a major threat to friendly relations with the Arabs. For the previous 2 years, a series of research studies on Palestine had been conducted by the State Department Interdivisional Committee. In their summary of January 1945, the committee members urged that Palestine be stipulated an international territory under United Nations trusteeship They're trying to keep everything neutral there, keep everybody happy. Now, President Franklin Roosevelt, and of course you have his picture also on page 132. Here's his photograph as well. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was vague on the issue. Now, Roosevelt assured Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia that he would not adopt a hostile stance to the Arabs. Remember, the Arabs were pro-Nazi. And the Arabs were afraid that the United States would treat them as enemies. But no, oil's too important. Oil's too important. We won't take a hostile stance toward you guys, even though you took a hostile stance toward us. And they found that Washington would not alter its basic approach toward Palestine, quote, without full and prior consultation with both Jews and Arabs. And here's a picture of the king of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. This is the fellow that he talked with. We won't be hostile toward you. Roosevelt subsequently remarked, note this, quote, on account of the Arab situation, nothing can be done in Palestine. Now the next sentence is a mark it up moment. Underline it, highlight it. David K. Niles, he was a political advisor to the White House. David K. Niles is probably correct when he once remarked, there are serious doubts in my mind that Israel would have come into being if Roosevelt had lived. Apparently Roosevelt was the single most important barrier at this time to the formation of the modern state of Israel. What happened? Did Roosevelt live? No. Roosevelt died in April of 1945 of a massive stroke. And suddenly, just like that, the main impediment was gone, and there was the way was clear now for a Jewish national home. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that weird? That's David K. Niles' assessment. Did the Lord step in there? It sure looks that way. Who was the vice president? Yeah, good old Harry Truman. Harry Truman's approach was rather less equivocal. There's Harry Truman. The current vice president now is elevated to the presidency. He had been a pro-Zionist from his early manhood. Truman sent Churchill a brief note on July 24, 1945, expressing hope that the British government would, quote, take steps to lift the restrictions of the White Paper into Palestine, and that the Prime Minister would let him have his ideas on the settlement of the Palestine question so that we could at a later date, discuss the problem in concrete terms. So he was quite open. Let's take another look at the Palestinian question. But before a reply could be sent, Churchill was defeated in the general election. Soon afterward, Truman dispatched Earl G. Harrison to study the conditions of the Jewish DPs. Harrison's report not only indicted American military insensitivity, but it also laid out a number of uncompromising proposals for solving the refugee question. With thinly veiled indignation, Harrison described the appalling circumstances of the death camp survivors, their despair, their frantic anxiety to leave the European morgue. At least 100,000 of them, the report suggested, ought to be evacuated immediately, and Palestine is definitely and preeminently the first choice. Page 133. What did Harry Truman do? Truman endorsed the proposal without question. He endorsed the whole Megillah. In a letter to Prime Minister Attlee on August 31st, 1945, the President urged that 100,000 Jews be allowed into Palestine forthwith. The appeal took Attlee by surprise. So much so that it required 2.5 weeks until Bevin and the Foreign Office could prepare a response. Now, the reply offered a clue to London's emerging approach to the Palestine question. It rejected the notion that Jewish displaced persons had suffered more than the non-Jewish victims of the Nazis. It rejected the plea to allow the 100,000 into the Holy Land. There's little doubt that the British government made a serious error in refusal to accept the 100,000. But it would have been useful if Bevan had exercised verbal restraint. If he had just kept his mouth shut, this would have been better. Rather than to warn on November 2nd, 1945, quote, that if the Jews, with all their suffering, want to get too much to the head of the queue, you have the danger of another anti-Semitic reaction through it all. In other words, don't you dare use your suffering as an excuse to get to the head of the line, or you will be hated again. What an attitude. This remark elicited a day of mourning in the Yishuv. And so illegal immigration was intensified. Even before World War II, the Zionist leadership had sponsored illegal immigration of Jews from Europe and the Middle East, known as Aliyah Beit, Immigration Plan B. Immigration Plan B was simply a euphemism for non-official or illegal immigration. And from the inception of the program in 1938, its director was Shaul Avigur. And you have Shaul's photograph on page 133. He's up on the board here. Aliyah Beit director Shaul Avigur. When the war ended, Avigur returned to Europe to open a new office, this time in Paris. His instructions from the Jewish agency were clear and unequivocal. They were to organize the immediate departure of the Jewish DPs for Palestine. Nor was this to be some kind of a clandestine smuggling effort of a few hundred or even a few thousand refugees. It was intended rather as a traffic organized on a scale of far-reaching proportions, involving tens of thousands of Jews. The homelessness of the victims of Nazism was to be exploited fully, even ruthlessly, to dramatize the fate of the Jewish people and the callousness of the British immigration policy on Palestine. By summer of 1945, the first groups of several hundred refugees were taken out of their camps in the American zone of Germany. They were in trucks supplied by the Jewish Brigade, and they were carried to the French and later the Austrian borders. Now, this is not a study of World War II, but we do have a DVD called In Our Hands, and it's a study of the Jewish Brigade in World War II. Basically, the Jewish soldiers assigned to the British 8th Army commandeered the British military trucks and camouflaged them, changed their identity, stole them, and used them to transport Jewish refugees to the ships. It's a fascinating story. It's an hour-and-a-half video. I'm going to put it in the library. It should be available next week if you want to check it out. But again, the story of the Jewish Brigade in World War II in Europe, how they bamboozled the Brits into using the British military equipment. All right, they were carried to French and Austrian borders. Here they made their way over mountain passes on foot to be transported afterward to French or Italian coasts and waiting Haganah ships. The largest number of Haganah vessels were Italian coastal ships of pre-war vintage. Hardly one of these obsolescent tubs was fit for a Mediterranean crossing. It appeared unthinkable to load them with hundreds of passengers. But nevertheless, hastily repaired in various Italian shipyards, they were sent to their embarkation rendezvous, usually secluded inlets near large Adriatic ports. Page 134. Now, the initial sailings caught the British by surprise. Half a dozen ships slipped by the British coastal watch in Palestine during the late autumn and the early winter of 1945 and 46, unloading some 4,000 refugees. In 1945, the Zionist leadership had rightly concluded that if Britain's attitude was based upon Arab strength, then Britain must equally be impressed by Jewish strength. And for the first time, the agency approved specific measures of physical resistance. Thus, in November 1945, the commanders of the Haganah and the two dissident Jewish underground forces reached an agreement. The agreement was that all future Etzel and Lehi operations would be coordinated under Haganah direction. For the next 8 months, these three groups undertook systematic attacks on British installations. During later 1945 and early 1946, the Etzel and Lecce embarked on a number of daring and successful raids against British armories. In October 1945, a joint Haganah-Etzel operation dynamited the British rail network at 200 different points. 200 different points throughout the country, effectively paralyzing British troop movements. The Haganah also destroyed 3 British naval launches that had been intercepting refugee vessels. And other acts of sabotage were carried out against British airfields, radar stations, and coastal lighthouses. Military reinforcements were promptly sent in. And the government's retaliatory measures became increasingly severe. And yet the underground agents were rarely caught. General Barker, the commanding officer in Palestine, had to admit later that, quote, "The Jews knew all government secrets and military plans within a day of our making a decision. Their intelligence system was uncanny." Now the attacks continued, hitting police, army, and naval garrisons. The British were confounded. Until the post-war period, they had been accustomed of thinking of violence in Palestine as exclusively an Arab phenomena. The force and savagery of the Jewish resistance came as a shock to them. You see, guys, we were no longer playing the passive Jew part anymore. We were now characterized by active insurrection. Nevertheless, Bevin's determination to solve the refugee issue and the future of Palestine in his own way was not easily undermined. 1946. In 1946, London formulated a new compromise approach to Truman's request. On October 26, 1945, before the House of Commons, and on November 13th, in a letter to the American president, Attlee proposed a joint Anglo-American committee to investigate the tragedy of the refugees and devise a solution to it. So the British love committees, don't they? Truman accepted the challenge, but with a qualification that Palestine alone, rather than any alternative refuge, would become the focus of inquiry. Attlee and Bevin grudgingly accepted the condition. Page 135. And you have this picture at the top of page 135. This is Ben-Gurion testifying before the Anglo-American Committee, giving his testimony regarding the state of affairs in the issue. Notice, a unanimous, underline that word unanimous, a unanimous report of less than 100 pages was issued May 1st, 1946. It recommended the immediate authorization of 100,000 immigration certificates. The report turned down either an Arab or a Jewish state. Without offering a detailed solution, the report proposed a regime in which future Jewish immigration would neither be subject to an Arab veto nor allowed to grow to such numbers as to produce a Jewish majority. During the interim, the mandate would continue to function. Well, how was it received? The Anglo-American report was categorically rejected. London's response was frigid. Isn't that amazing? London came up with the idea, and then London rejected the recommendations of their own idea. The text of the document was published in Washington May 1st, 1946, and the same day, oh, good old Harry, he didn't hesitate. The same day, Truman publicly announced his approval for the recommendations of admitting 100,000 DPs into Palestine. Now, that document still exists. Here is a picture of it, a survey of Palestine. And if you want to read it, for example, it is available on Amazon. It's 100 pages. I think it's pretty spendy because it's not a high-demand document. But you can read it if you're interested. A survey on Palestine available on Amazon.com. Now, another mark it up moment. I like this sentence here. I'm no friend of Bevin at all.
I can tell that.
E.F. Francis Williams, Bevan's best friend and biographer, wrote later that Truman's statement threw Bevan into one of the blackest rages I ever saw him in. My heart bleeds. My heart bleeds.
Now, here we say there, you know what, and then they turn around and reject our proposal.
Oh, sure. Yep. If rejection of Truman's appeal was a serious tactical blunder, Bevan insisted on compounding it by the harsh insensitivity of his remarks. He had foot and mouth disease, you guys. Thus, his irritated reaction to the president's position was to declare publicly that the Americans favored the admission of the 100,000 Jews into Palestine because they didn't want too many of them in New York. Anyway, that's a slightly anti-Semitic, bigoted statement.
No.
The outrage provoked by this statement was not limited to the Jews. Sailing for the United States shortly afterward, Bevan discovered that the stevedores in the port of New York refused to handle his baggage. Just a tiny bit of revenge. Tiny protest, yes. All right. We've got 2 minutes left. And our next subject then is the fact that Etzel, the Irgun, will blow up the King David Hotel. So on that interesting note, with that little carrot hung out before you, we'll call it quits for tonight. Cindy, question?
133, you said summer, by the summer of 1945, yes, it says autumn.
Okay, if I misspoke, it would be go by what's written in the...
I think it's supposed to be summer, based
Oh,
on...
did I have... Okay, I'll look that over. Thank you. Might be a misprint there, you guys. All right, let me pray. Let me pray, and I'll turn you guys loose. Father, again, we just want to pause and thank you for your sovereignty. You are sovereign over our lives. You're sovereign over the lives of nations and over kings. You raise up kings and you bring kings down. And we saw that very clearly here with the removal of Franklin D. Roosevelt as an impediment to the Jewish national home. You're in charge, Lord. We don't always understand your ways, but it's always your ways that will dominate and will be completed and experienced in this world. So, Lord, help us always to remember that you are the sovereign King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and we need to order our lives around your will found in your word. So, Lord, help us to be good students of your word so that when we look out into the world, we will be able to understand what you are doing. And so we thank you for your word, which gives us that basic understanding and will help guide us through our lives. And we ask for your guidance in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week.